Good evening, and welcome back to the Poe Museum. I appear to be a little bit under the weather this evening, but it could be worse. I could have dissolved into a loathsome, nearly liquid mass of detestable putrescence. So there's always that. So while I recover, why don't you enjoy tonight's installment of the Curator's Crypt. The Dead Speak. A scientific experiment took place in the year 1845 in New York City, and it's recorded in this book, Mesmerism in Articula Mortis. A group of doctors have gathered around the dying patient who's donated his body to science to see if the power of mesmerism can keep his mind alive after his body is dead. The preface to this volume says that it is universally believed in New York City, despite how fantastic the details may sound. In fact, this story was widely believed. The Boston spiritualist Robert Collier wrote to Poe, "Your account of M. Valdemar's case has been universally copied in the city and has created a very great sensation. It requires from me no apology in stating that I have not the least doubt of the possibility of such a phenomenon, for I did actually restore to active animation a person who died from excessive drinking of ardent spirits. I will give you the detailed account on your reply to this, which I require for publication, in order to put at rest the growing impression that your account is merely a splendid creation of your own brain, not having any truth in it. My dear sir, I have battled the storm of public derision too long on the subject of mesmerism to be now found in the rear ranks. Though I have not publicly lectured for more than 2 years, I have steadily made it a subject of deep investigation." So people were believing this fantastic account. But they shouldn't have. The author was, of course, Edgar Allan Poe. So this book, although printed as factual, is really just part of a hoax that Poe is perpetrating on the public. It was originally published under the title The Facts of the Case of M. Valdemar in New York City in the American Review, but took on a life of its own afterwards, being reprinted in British medical journals and here in pamphlet form. And not everybody believed it. The editor of the New York Tribune wrote, "This article in the American Review of this month, entitled The Facts of M. Valdemar's Case by Edgar A. Poe, is of course a romance. Who could have supposed it otherwise? Those who have read Mr. Poe's Visit to the Maelstrom, South Pole, etc., have not been puzzled by it. Yet we learn that several good, matter-of-fact citizens must have been sorely. It is a pretty good specimen of Poe's style of giving an air of reality to fictions, and we utterly condemn the choice of a subject. But whoever thought it a veracious recital must have the bump of faith, large, very large indeed." To which Poe answered in the Broadway Journal, "For our parts, we find it difficult to understand how any dispassionate transcendentalist can doubt the facts as we state them. They are by no means so incredible as the marvels which are hourly narrated and believed on the topic of mesmerism. Why cannot a man's death be postponed indefinitely by mesmerism? Why cannot a man talk after he is dead? Why? That is the question. And as soon as the Tribune has answered it to our satisfaction, we will talk to it farther." At this same time, a Scottish mesmerist wrote to Poe, beseeching him for the sake of science and truth to reveal whether the story was true. Of course, Poe replied, "Hoax is precisely the word suited to Mr. Valdemar's case. Some few believe it, but I do not, and don't you." So here's Poe really enjoying this chance to pull one over on the public. Poe had written about mesmerism for a while. It had been a fad invented by Anton Mesmer, originally called animal magnetism. It was based on the idea that all creatures, even inanimate objects, have magnetic fields running through them. If you control those fields, you can control someone's mind. You can make a chicken lay eggs at the right time. There were books on mesmerism coming out, and there are even trance mesmerists, one of whom was Andrew Jackson Davis, the Poughkeepsie seer, who could go on stage in the 1840s, claim to enter a trance state and communicate with spirits from the other side, because while you're in the trance state, according to the theory, you could see ghosts. Now, did Poe believe this? Well, he wrote a letter to James Russell Lowell explaining his theories of the spirit. I have no belief in spirituality. I think the word a mere word. No one is really a conception of spirit. We cannot imagine what is not. We deceive ourselves by the idea of infinitely rarefied matter. Matter escapes the senses by degrees. A stone, a metal, liquid, the atmosphere, a gas. Beyond this, there are other modifications more rare. But to all we attach a notion of a constitution of particles, atomic composition. For this reason only we think spirit different. For spirit, we say, is unparticled and therefore is not matter. But it is clear that if we proceed sufficiently far in our ideas of verification, we shall arrive at a point where the particles coalesce. For although the particles be infinite, the infinity of littleness and the spaces between them is an absurdity. The unparticled matter permeating and impelling all things is God, and therefore is the thought activity is the thought of God which creates. Man and other thinking beings are individualizations of the unparticled matter. Man exists as a person by being clothed with matter, the unparticled matter which individualizes him. Thus habited, his life is rudimental. What we call death is a painful metamorphosis. The stars are the habitations of the rudimental beings, but for the necessity of the rudimental life, there would have been no worlds. At death, the worm is the butterfly, still material, but of a matter unrecognized by our organs, unrecognized occasionally perhaps by the sleepwalker directly without organs, through the mesmeric medium. Thus a sleepwalker may see ghosts. Divested of the rudimental covering, the being inhabits space, but what we suppose to be a immaterial universe passing everywhere and acting all things by mere volition, cognizant of all secrets, but that of the nature of God's volition, the motion or activity of the unparticled matter. So it sounds like Poe, even though he denied believing in the spirit, did sort of believe in the spirit. And he was in contact with some of these mesmerists and early spiritualists. The spiritualists are really going to come to fore just a few years later, when Andrew Jackson Davis in March of 1848 said that he had a revelation that on that day the world would be changed forever. And about that same time, in Hydesville, New York, two girls started hearing knocking noises. And they would ask the spirit questions, and it would knock twice or knock once in response to their questions. And people started coming far and wide to meet the Fox sisters and have them communicate with the spirit for them. Before you know it, these mediums who thought of themselves as the medium of communication, think of a telephone as a medium of communication, they're the ones who are connecting you with the spirit world, and for the right price, they could help you contact the dead. And a lot of people in Poe's life, including his fiancée, Sarah Helen Whitman, were devout spiritualists. They believed in holding seances, where you'd sit in the dark, you'd try to listen out for a sign from the other side. Whether Poe believed this or not is open to debate, but he did contact Andrew Jackson Davis and ask him his opinions on his stories about mesmerism, not only the facts in the case of M. Valdemar, but also mesmeric revelation. And according to Poe, The Swedenborgians inform me that they have discovered all that I said in a magazine article entitled Mesmeric Revelation to be absolutely true. Although at first they were very strongly inclined to doubt my veracity, a thing which in this particular instance I never dreamed of not doing myself. The story is a pure fiction from beginning to end. In fact, when Poe wrote another mesmerist, George Bush, he said, "Of course, you will of course understand that the article is purely a fiction, but I have embodied in it some thoughts which are original with myself, and I am exceedingly anxious to learn if they have claim to absolute originality. Also, how far they will strike you as well-based. If you would be so kind as to look over the paper and give me in brief your opinion, I will consider it a high favor." So what did Jackson think of Poe? Jackson also thought that Poe, even though he never admitted to it, was a spiritualist himself. He was followed around by a spirit wherever he went. A dark shadow followed him. And after Poe died, Jackson outlived him, so he continued to write about Poe and his mesmeric abilities. And even into the 20th century, people thought that Poe had the power to communicate with the dead. There was a poet, Lizzie Doden. Her specialty in the 1850s and 60s was writing poetry by channeling the spirits of dead poets. So she was able to channel Poe's spirits, and supposedly he wrote poems like The Streets of Baltimore, which is really just kind of a cheap ripoff of The Raven. Instead of saying, "Quoth the Raven nevermore," she ends the lines with "In the Streets of Baltimore." So that one's a pretty obvious one. I don't think Poe's spirit would have tried to get away with something like that, but she did. But even into the early 20th century, there were spiritualists who were still holding seances, still trying to communicate with Poe's spirit. Even Poe's fiancée, I mentioned, Sarah Helen Whitman, held regular seances and supposedly attempted to contact Poe. She said she received 3 spiritual letters. We don't know what they were. Also, Poe's own literary executor, Rufus W. Griswold, who's not really a believer in spiritualism, but he got some of the Fox sisters together to hold a seance, along with Horace Greeley of the New York Tribune. And there's no record that they ever contacted Poe at that one either, even though it was shortly after his death. So the case is still open. Not everybody believed it. Some people did. Poe, he would deny it one minute and then admit to it the next. So maybe he didn't. We do have Spiritualism to thank for one of our greatest donors to the collection, John Wooster Robertson, who was a spiritualist living in California, operating a mental hospital in Livermore, California. And he thought that Poe was capable of auto-mesmerism, that he would go into a trance state and communicate with spirits from the other side in that condition. And Robertson became so fascinated with Poe that he tried to collect every single one of Poe's first editions, all of his first printings. And in the 1920s and 30s, he gave his entire collection to the Poe Museum, where you can see it today. So thanks to John Robertson. And thanks to you for joining us and supporting the Poe Museum. I hope to see you again next time. And for those Patreon supporters, thanks for continuing to give. And if you're not a Patreon supporter and you're viewing this somewhere else, you could have already seen this a week ago if you just joined our Patreon at patreon.com/PoeMuseum. Well, thank you for joining us this evening, and we'll see you next time on the Curator's Crypt.